The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes across James Sullivan's ranch, the kind of snowfall that muffled all sound and turned the world into a blank canvas. James stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the storm blanket his land. At 67, the cold bothered his joints more than it used to, but he'd never been one to stay indoors when there was work to be done. His ranch sat on the edge of Pine Valley, far enough from town that he rarely had visitors. That suited James just fine. After his wife Rose passed 5 years ago, he'd grown comfortable with solitude. The neighbors called him a hermit, but he preferred the term self-sufficient. James pulled his worn leather jacket tighter and stepped off the porch. The barn needed checking before the storm got worse. The weather report had called for record snowfall, and the last thing he needed was for the roof to collapse under the weight. Halfway to the barn, a sound cut through the stillness, not the whistle of the wind or the creak of snow-laden branches, but something alive. James stopped, tilting his head to listen. There it was again, a high-pitched whiny followed by a thud. "Now what in the world?" James muttered, changing direction and heading toward the sound. It came from the back of his property where his land met the wild hills. The snow made walking difficult, especially for a man whose knees protested every step. But James pressed on, following the increasingly distressed sounds until he reached the old fence line. There, trapped in a tangle of fallen barbed wire and thrashing in panic, lay a horse. Not one of his. James hadn't kept horses in years. This was one of the wild mustangs that roamed the hills beyond his property. The horse was a magnificent creature, or would have been if not for its current state. Its coat was dark as midnight, with a splash of white between the eyes. The animal's powerful muscles strained as it fought against the wire cutting into its back leg. "Easy now," James said softly, approaching with caution. The horse's eyes rolled in fear, showing whites all around. It lunged forward, trying to escape, only to cry out as the wire cut deeper. James knew this horse by reputation. The locals called it Shadow Dancer, or sometimes just the Black Devil. It led one of the wild herds and had a nasty habit of destroying fences and raiding farms when winter made food scarce. Several ranchers had tried to capture or shoot it over the years, but the horse was too clever, too fast. Not so clever now, though. "You've got yourself in quite a mess, haven't you?" James said, keeping his voice low and even. "Let's see if we can fix that." The horse snorted and pawed at the ground, eyes never leaving James. Blood stained the snow beneath its trapped leg. James retreated to the barn and returned with wire cutters, a blanket, and some rope. He approached slowly, talking all the while in the same gentle tone he'd once used to tame spirited colts. "Don't suppose you'll make this easy for either of us," he said. "But that leg needs tending, and this storm's not letting up." The horse watched him, nostrils flaring, muscles tense to flee. But as James inched closer, it seemed to understand its predicament. When James was within 10 feet, the horse stopped struggling and stood trembling, sides heaving with exhaustion. "That's it," James encouraged. "Just let me help you." It took nearly an hour of patient coaxing before James could get close enough to cut the wire. The horse flinched at each snip but didn't bolt. When the last strand fell away, James expected the animal to run, injured leg or not. Instead, it collapsed, onto the snow, too weak from blood loss and struggled to stand. "Well, I can't leave you here," James said, scratching his stubbled chin. "Rose would never forgive me." He managed to get the blanket over the shivering animal and fashioned a makeshift halter from the rope. The horse's eyes held a mixture of fear and what James could only describe as resignation. Getting the massive animal to the barn was a struggle that left James sweating despite the cold. He had to stop every few yards to catch his breath, his bad knee screaming in protest. But eventually they made it. The barn was old but sturdy, with 3 empty stalls that hadn't housed animals in years. James led the horse into the largest one and quickly set about cleaning the wounded leg. "Telephone's out, so Doc Miller won't be making any house calls tonight," he told the horse as he worked. "You'll have to make do with my field medicine." The cut was deep but had missed any major blood vessels. James cleaned it thoroughly, applied antibiotic ointment from his first aid kit, and wrapped it in clean bandages. Throughout the process, the horse watched him with wary eyes but remained surprisingly still. "You're smarter than you look," James said, patting the horse's neck cautiously. The animal tensed but allowed the touch. "Need a name if you're staying. Can't keep calling you horse now, can I?" James stood back and studied the midnight coat gleaming in the lantern light. "Thunder," he decided. "You sound like a summer storm when you run." That night the blizzard hit with full force. James made trips between the house and barn, checking on Thunder and bringing fresh water. By morning the snow had piled 4 feet high in places, cutting the ranch off from the outside world. For the next week, James's life fell into a new routine. He'd wake at dawn, check on Thunder, change the bandages, and offer feed and fresh water. At first, the horse would only eat when James left the stall, but by the 5th day, Thunder began taking apple slices from James's outstretched palm, careful not to nip the fingers that fed him. Word got around eventually. In small towns, news traveled even when people didn't. When the roads cleared enough, for visitors, James's neighbor Frank was the first to arrive. "Heard you've got that devil horse in your barn," Frank said without preamble as he stomped snow from his boots on James's porch. "He's no devil," James replied, "just scared and hurt." Frank shook his head. "Bill Jenkins wants that animal dead. Says it destroyed half his hay storage last month." "Bill Jenkins couldn't tell a horse from a cow in poor light," James said dryly. "Besides, Thunder's staying here until he's healed. After that, he can choose where he goes." "Thunder?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "You named that wild thing? Next you'll be putting a saddle on it." James just smiled and offered coffee. As weeks turned into months, Thunder's leg healed. The deep gash closed, leaving a raised scar that would always mark the encounter. James removed the makeshift stall door, leaving Thunder free to leave whenever he chose. But the horse stayed. Spring came to Pine Valley, turning the snow-covered fields to mud and then to green pasture dotted with wildflowers. James repaired the fences with Thunder following at his heels like an oversized dog. The horse never wandered far, even when other wild mustangs appeared on the ridge above the ranch calling to their former herd member. "You're free to go with them," James told Thunder one evening as they both watched the distant herd. "Don't owe me anything." Thunder nickered softly and nudged James's shoulder, nearly knocking the older man off balance. The first time James felt dizzy was while mending the chicken coop. The world tilted sideways, and he had to grab the wall to stay upright. Thunder, grazing nearby, lifted his head and trotted over, pressing against James as if offering support. "Just stood up too fast," James assured the horse, patting its neck. But deep down he knew it was more than that. The dizzy spells came more frequently after that. Some mornings James could barely get out of bed. On those days, Thunder would appear at his bedroom window nickering until James showed himself. One afternoon, while James sat on the porch fighting another wave of dizziness, his phone rang. It was his daughter Lynn calling from the city, their monthly check-in that usually lasted 5 minutes. "You sound terrible, Dad," she said after hearing his breathless greeting. "Just a cold," he lied. "I'm coming out there," Lynn decided, surprising them both. It's been too long anyway. James wanted to argue but found he didn't have the energy. And truthfully, the thought of seeing Lynn after nearly 2 years brought a warmth to his chest that had nothing to do with fever. That evening, as James sat, watching the sunset with Thunder grazing nearby, he wondered how his city-raised daughter would react to his unusual friendship with the once wild horse. Lynn had always been more comfortable with concrete than pasture. As if sensing his thoughts, Thunder lifted his head and walked over to James, his dark eyes somehow knowing. The horse gently rested his muzzle against James's shoulder. "She'll love you," James said, stroking the sleek neck. "How could she not?" Thunder snorted as if in agreement, and together they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains, 2 unlikely friends facing whatever tomorrow might bring. Lynn Silver sat and looked out of place on the dusty driveway of her father's ranch. She stepped out, designer boots immediately sinking into the soft ground, and frowned at the mud now coating their perfect shine. The drive from Portland had been long, and the last 20 miles on country roads had left her with a stiff neck and a headache brewing behind her eyes. She hadn't been back to Pine Valley in almost 2 years. Not since that awful Christmas when she and her father had argued about her move to the city. James had never understood why she'd left ranch life behind, why she'd chosen concrete and crowds over open skies and solitude. But the tired voice on the phone had worried her. Her father wasn't one to admit weakness, and she'd heard it there beneath his gruff assurances that he was fine. The front door of the ranch house opened, and James appeared, looking thinner than Lynn remembered. His face lit up at the sight of her, and for a moment she saw the strong, vital man from her childhood. Then he stepped into the sunlight, and she couldn't ignore the truth. Her father had aged years and months. "There's my city girl," he called, the old nickname both welcome and painful. Lynn crossed the yard and hugged him, alarmed at how fragile he felt beneath her arms. "You should have called me sooner," she whispered. James pulled back, patting her shoulder. "Nothing to call about, just getting old." But Lynn noticed how he leaned against the porch railing for support, how carefully he moved as he led her inside. The house looked much the same. Worn furniture, faded photographs on the walls, her mother's quilt still draped over the back of the couch. It smelled of coffee and wood smoke, scents that instantly transported Lynn back to her childhood. "Have you seen a doctor?" she asked, setting her bag down in the living room. James waved a dismissive hand. "Doc Miller comes by when he can, says I'm wearing out is all." Lynn knew her father well enough to recognize the lie. Before she could press further, a loud whinny sounded from outside, followed by the thud of hooves on the porch steps. "What in the world?" Lynn moved to the window and gasped. A massive black horse stood on the porch, its head nearly level with the window as it peered inside. "That's Thunder," James said, a note of pride in his voice. "Found him trapped in a storm last winter. We've been keeping each other company." Lynn stared at the horse, then at her father. "On the porch, Dad? That's a wild animal." "Not so wild anymore," James replied. He opened the front door and spoke softly to the horse. "This is Lynn, my daughter, the one I told you about." To Lynn's amazement, the horse lowered its head as if in greeting, dark eyes regarding her with what looked strangely like intelligence. "He's beautiful," she admitted, staying safely behind her father. "But shouldn't he be in the barn or pasture?" James chuckled. "Thunder goes where he pleases. He's earned that right." He reached up to stroke the horse's neck. "We understand each other." Over dinner that evening, a simple meal of beef stew that James had prepared before her arrival, Lynn tried to piece together what was happening with her father's health. James deflected her questions with practiced ease, turning the conversation to her life in Portland, her job as a graphic designer, her friends. "No special someone yet?" he asked, pushing his half-eaten stew around his bowl. Lynn shook her head. "Work keeps me busy." She didn't mention the string of failed relationships, men who couldn't understand her reluctance to fully commit. How could she explain that part of her was always looking toward the horizon, just like her father had taught her? After dinner, James insisted on showing her Thunder's favorite spot, a rise behind the house that overlooked the valley. The walk was slow, James pausing frequently to catch his breath. Thunder appeared as they crested the hill, materializing from the dusk like a shadow come to life. "He always knows," James said softly. "Always where I need him to be." They sat, on an old bench James had built years ago, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Thunder grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on them. "I'm dying, Lynn," James said suddenly, his voice as matter-of-fact as if he were commenting on the weather. The words hung in the cool evening air. Lynn felt her throat tighten. "What did Doc Miller say?" "Cancer. Spread too far for treatment. 3 months, maybe 4. James looked at her, his eyes clear. "I've made my peace with it." Lynn felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You should have told me sooner. We could have gotten second opinions, tried treatments in Portland." James shook his head. "I'm 77 years old, had a good run. Don't want to spend what's left hooked up to machines in some hospital." "But Dad, what I want," he continued firmly, "is to stay here on my land with my memories." He nodded toward Thunder. "And my friend." Lynn wanted to argue, to insist they fight this together, but the determined set of her father's jaw was all too familiar. Instead, she reached for his hand, surprised at how easily her fingers entwined with his calloused ones. "I'll stay," she said. "For as long as you need." James squeezed her hand. "Thank you." The days settled into a new routine. Lynn worked remotely from the ranch, setting up her laptop at the kitchen table with a view of the barn. She took over the cooking and cleaning, shocked at how little food her father ate. Each day she coaxed him to take a few more bites, to drink the protein shakes she drove 30 miles to purchase. Thunder became a constant presence, appearing at the kitchen window each morning, accompanying James on his increasingly short walks, standing guard when the old man needed to rest. Lynn found herself talking to the horse, telling him about her day when James was napping, asking him to watch over her father when she had to make supply runs to town. "He understands more than you'd think," James told her one evening as they watched Thunder chase away a coyote that had ventured too close to the chicken coop. "Animals know things we don't." As weeks passed, James grew weaker. The walks stopped altogether. Some days he couldn't leave his bed. On those days, Thunder would stand outside his window for hours, nickering softly whenever James stirred. Doc. Miller visited regularly now, bringing morphine for the pain that medications could no longer touch. After one such visit, while James slept, the doctor pulled Lynn aside. "It won't be long now," he said gently. "Days, maybe a week. He's fighting hard, but the body can only take so much." Lynn nodded, numb after weeks of watching her father fade. "He's hanging on for something, I just don't know what." That night, as Lynn sat beside her father's bed, James woke suddenly, more lucid than he'd been in days. "Need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About the ranch." Lynn leaned closer. "What about it, Dad?" "Papers in my desk, bottom drawer, metal box." James's breathing was labored, each word an effort. "Important." "I'll find them," Lynn promised. "Don't worry about that now." James shook his head, frustrated. "Need to know. You'll do it. After. Whatever it is, I'll take care of it," Lynn assured him, smoothing back his thin white hair. James seemed to relax slightly. "One more thing," he said. "Thunder." "I'll make sure he's cared for," Lynn said immediately. "I promise." "No." James clutched at her hand with surprising strength. "At the funeral. Want him there." Lynn blinked in surprise. "At your funeral? Dad, that's not... Promise me." His eyes were intense, fever bright. "Needs to be there. Important." Lynn wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons why having a half-wild horse at a funeral was a terrible idea. But looking into her father's desperate eyes, she couldn't deny him this final request. "I promise," she said softly. "Thunder will be there." James nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. "Good girl." 3 days later, as dawn broke over the eastern hills, James Sullivan took his last breath. Lynn sat beside him, holding his hand as it grew cold in hers. Through her tears, she noticed Thunder outside the window, head bowed as if the horse somehow knew. The arrangements were simple, just as James would have wanted. A pine coffin, a plot on the hill overlooking the valley, beside her mother's grave. Pastor Wilson from the small church in town would say a few words. Most of Pine Valley would attend. In small communities, everyone came to pay respects, whether they'd been close to the deceased or not. The day before the funeral, Frank, her father's neighbor, helped Lynn dig through the desk drawer to find the metal box James had mentioned. "Aren't you going to open it?" Frank asked as Lynn set the dusty box aside. She shook her head. "After the funeral. Dad wanted it that way." Frank nodded, understanding the strange logic of last requests. "Heard about his other wish," he said cautiously. "About the horse," Lynn sighed. "People will think it's crazy." "It is crazy," Frank agreed. "But James and that horse, they had something special. Never seen anything like it. That night, Lynn sat on the porch, the metal box on her lap, Thunder standing silently nearby. She stroked the horse's velvety nose, finding comfort in his solid presence. "Just you and me now," she whispered. "We'll get through tomorrow, and then we'll figure out what comes next." Thunder nickered softly and pressed his head against her shoulder, as if making a promise of his own. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that James would have spent mending fences or tending his vegetable garden. Lynn stood at the kitchen window, coffee cup clutched in her hands, watching as the first cars began appearing on the long driveway to the ranch. He would have hated all this fuss, she murmured to herself. Her father had been a private man, uncomfortable with attention or crowds, but in Pine Valley, funerals were community affairs, chances for the scattered residents to come together and reaffirm their connections. Thunder stood in the pasture nearest the house, his dark coat gleaming in the morning sun. The horse hadn't left the property since James died, though Lynn had removed all barriers that might have kept him there. She wondered if he somehow understood what had happened, if he was mourning in his own way. A knock at the door pulled Lynn from her thoughts. Pastor Wilson stood on the porch, his round face solemn beneath thinning gray hair. "Lynn," he said, taking her hands in his, "my deepest condolences. Your father was a good man." "Thank you, Pastor." Lynn stepped back to let him in. "Coffee?" "No time, I'm afraid. I wanted to speak with you before the service." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Frank mentioned something about your father's unusual request." Lynn braced herself. She'd known this conversation was coming. "Yes, Dad wanted Thunder at the funeral." Pastor Wilson's bushy eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. "The horse? At the graveside?" "It was his dying wish," Lynn said simply. "I promised him." The pastor sighed, running a hand over his face. "Lynn, I understand respecting your father's wishes, but a wild animal at a funeral service. It's just not done. What if it becomes agitated? What if someone gets hurt?" "He's not wild anymore," Lynn argued, thinking of how gently Thunder had nudged her shoulder last night as if offering comfort. "And he was important to Dad. They had a special connection." "Be that as it may, I promised him, Pastor." Lynn's voice was firm. "This was one of the last things he asked of me." Pastor Wilson studied her face, seeing the same stubborn determination that James had been known for. "Very well," he relented, "but please keep the animal at a distance and perhaps have someone ready to lead it away if necessary." Lynn nodded, relieved. "Thank you. I've asked Frank to help with that." As the pastor left to prepare for the service, Lynn went to her bedroom to change. She'd brought a simple black dress from Portland, something suitable for a funeral yet not too formal. James would have scoffed at anything fancier. Outside, more cars were arriving. Lynn recognized most of them: Doc Miller's ancient station wagon, the Hendersons' pickup truck, Mrs. Abernathy's blue compact car. Pine Valley turning out to say goodbye to one of its oldest residents. Lynn pinned her hair back, applied minimal makeup, and slipped on low heels that immediately sank into the soft ground outside. She should have known better, should have brought different shoes, but her mind had been elsewhere when packing. Frank met her by the barn, dressed in clean jeans and a pressed Western shirt, his version of formal wear. "Got a halter for Thunder," he said, holding up a simple leather headstall. "Though I'm not sure he'll let me put it on him." "Let me try," Lynn said, taking the halter. She walked to the pasture fence and called softly, "Thunder, come here, boy." To her surprise, the horse trotted over immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her call. He lowered his head, allowing her to slip the halter on without protest. "Well, I'll be," Frank muttered. "That horse has better manners than half the people in this town." They led Thunder to a spot beneath a large oak tree, a short distance from where the service would be held. The site James had chosen for his final resting place was on the same hill where he'd told Lynn about his illness, overlooking the valley with the mountains rising blue and distant beyond. Lynn's mother, Rose, had been buried there 12 years earlier, her simple headstone now weathered by sun and rain. People began gathering around the gravesite, where James's pine coffin rested beside the freshly dug hole. Lynn greeted them mechanically, accepting condolences and casseroles with equal numbness. The pain of her father's death felt distant, unreal, as if it had happened to someone else. The whispers started as soon as people noticed Thunder standing beneath the oak. Heads turned, glances were exchanged, voices lowered in disapproval or curiosity. "Is that the wild horse? What's it doing here? Never heard of such a thing." James always was a bit odd. Mrs. Abernathy, a tiny woman with steel-gray hair who had taught Lynn in 3rd grade, approached her with pursed lips. "Dear, is it wise to have that animal here? I heard it attacked Bill Jenkins last year." "That's not true," Lynn said quietly. "And my father wanted him here." Mrs. Abernathy patted her arm. "Grief makes us do strange things, dear. No one would think less of you if you changed your mind." But Lynn stood firm. As more people arrived, the murmurs grew, but she ignored them, focusing instead on the memory of her father's face when he'd made her promise. Pastor Wilson called everyone to gather around the grave. Lynn stood closest to the coffin, with Frank beside her. Thunder remained under the oak tree, watching the proceedings with what Lynn could only describe as solemn attention. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the life of James Sullivan," Pastor Wilson began. "A man of the land, a devoted father, a steadfast friend." The service was simple and mercifully brief. Pastor Wilson spoke of James's life in Pine Valley, his service in the Army as a young man, his decades of working the land. Several neighbors shared short memories. James helping during a particularly harsh winter, James teaching the Henderson boys to fish, James quietly delivering firewood to elderly residents when their supplies ran low. Through it all, Thunder stood motionless under the oak, his dark eyes fixed on the coffin. Only his ears moved, flicking occasionally as if listening to each speaker. When it came time for Lynn to speak, her prepared words deserted her. She looked out at the gathering of weathered faces, people who had known her father far longer than she had in many ways, and felt like an outsider. "My father," she began hesitantly, "was not an easy man to know. He kept his thoughts to himself, his feelings even more so. But he loved deeply this land, this community, my mother." She paused, swallowing hard. "When I left for the city, I thought I was leaving him behind too. I was wrong. He was always with me, in how I see the world, in how I face challenges, in the values I hold dear." She glanced toward Thunder. "In his final months, he found an unlikely friend. Some of you might think it strange, a man and a wild horse. But they recognized something in each other, a stubborn independence maybe, or a need for connection that neither could put into words." A few heads nodded in understanding. Bill Jenkins, standing at the back of the crowd, frowned and crossed his arms. "My father asked for Thunder to be here today," Lynn continued. "It was one of his last requests. I think he believed that Thunder deserved the chance to say goodbye too." As the service concluded and Pastor Wilson offered a final prayer, the pallbearers, Frank and 5 other men from town, stepped forward to lower the coffin into the ground. Lynn tossed a handful of soil onto the pine wood, whispering a private farewell as it landed with a soft thud. Then came the moment she had dreaded, leaving her father behind, walking away from the grave to the house where food and community awaited, where life somehow had to continue. Her legs felt wooden as she turned from the gravesite. A sudden commotion behind her made Lynn turn back. Thunder had pulled free from his tether and was trotting toward the grave, his movements purposeful. "Grab him," Bill Jenkins shouted. "That crazy animal will hurt someone." But Thunder ignored the panicked voices and scattered mourners. He went straight to the half-filled grave and stopped, looking down at the coffin now partially covered with earth. "Thunder," Lynn called softly, taking a step toward him. "It's okay, boy." The horse looked at her, and Lynn could have sworn she saw grief in those dark eyes. Then Thunder did something entirely unexpected. He raised one hoof and brought it down firmly on the loose soil beside the grave. People gasped. Mrs. Abernathy clutched her chest. Bill Jenkins lunged forward as if to grab the horse, but Frank held him back. "Wait," Frank said. "Just wait." Thunder raised his hoof again and brought it down more forcefully, pawing at the earth beside the grave, not on the coffin itself as some feared, but at the ground immediately adjacent to it. Lynn moved closer, confused. "Thunder, what are you doing?" The horse continued pawing, more insistently now, dirt flying as his powerful legs dug into the earth. After several moments, there was a dull metallic sound, his hoof striking something buried beneath the surface. Curious despite her grief, Lynn knelt beside the hole Thunder had created. There, partly uncovered by the horse's digging, was a corner of something metal. She reached down and pulled, unearthing a small metal container identical to the one James had directed her to in his desk. The funeral guests had crept closer, their fear of Thunder forgotten in the face of this strange development. "What is it?" Frank asked, peering over Lynn's shoulder. Lynn turned the box over in her hands, brushing off clumps of dirt. It was sealed with a simple latch, unlike the one in the house which had been locked. "I don't know," she replied, looking up at Thunder, who had stopped digging and now stood quietly, watching her. "But I think Thunder did." A hush fell over the funeral gathering as Lynn held the mud-covered metal box in her hands. Thunder stood beside her, his breathing steady, eyes fixed on the container as if willing her to open it. "Well, don't keep us in suspense," Frank said, breaking the silence. "What's in it?" Lynn brushed away the remaining dirt with trembling fingers. The box was old, its once silver surface dulled by years buried in the earth. Unlike the locked box, from her father's desk, this one had a simple latch that opened easily under her touch. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Lynn removed it gently, aware of the crowd pressing closer, their curiosity overcoming their earlier fear of Thunder. "It's a letter," she said, unfolding the brittle paper. "From my father." The handwriting was unmistakably James's, strong, slanted, strokes that covered the page in blue ink. Lynn cleared her throat and began to read aloud. "To whoever finds this, hopefully my daughter Lynn with Thunder's help," she began, her voice catching slightly. She glanced up at the horse, who nickered, softly as if encouraging her to continue. "If you're reading this, then two things have happened. I've passed on, and Thunder has done exactly what I hoped he would. That horse always was smarter than most people gave him credit for." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Even in death, James Sullivan's blunt manner of speaking came through clearly. "There's another box in my desk drawer," Lynn continued reading. "The key to understanding everything is to have both. Thunder knew where this one was buried because he watched me put it here last fall, back when I first learned I was sick. I didn't tell him what was in it, but somehow he understood it was important." Lynn paused, remembering how her father had directed her to the first box just days before he died. She'd brought it with her to the funeral but hadn't yet opened it, respecting his wish that she wait until after the service. "Lynn, honey," the letter continued, "I know you think I'm just a foolish old man with a strange attachment to a wild horse. Maybe I am, but Thunder and I found each other when we both needed someone most. He saved me from loneliness in my final days, and I saved him from a storm that would have taken his life. There's a purpose in that, don't you think?" Lynn blinked. Back tears, feeling the truth of her father's words. She'd witnessed firsthand the bond between James and Thunder, something deeper than simple companionship. "What's in these two boxes will explain everything. It's my final gift to you, to Thunder, and to Pine Valley. I hope you'll understand why I kept it secret until now." The letter ended with a simple, "Love always, Dad," and a postscript, "Trust Thunder. He knows more than you think." As Lynn folded the letter, murmurs spread through the gathered mourners. Mrs. Abernathy dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Bill Jenkins looked uncomfortable but intrigued. Pastor Wilson stroked his chin thoughtfully. "What's in the other box?" someone called out. Lynn shook her head. "I don't know yet. It's locked and I haven't found the key." Thunder suddenly nudged her shoulder, pushing his nose against her pocket where she'd placed the letter. When she didn't respond, he repeated the gesture more insistently. "I think he wants you to check the letter again," Frank suggested. Lynn removed the letter from its plastic sleeve and examined it more carefully. As she turned it over, a small key taped to the back of the paper caught her eye. "Well, I'll be," Frank murmured. "Your dad thought of everything. Should we open the other box now?" Lynn asked, looking around at the funeral guests. It felt strange to be turning her father's somber service into something else entirely, but she sensed that this was exactly what James had wanted. One final surprise, one last chance to bring his community together. Pastor Wilson stepped forward. "Perhaps we should conclude the burial service first," he suggested gently. "Show proper respect before moving on to whatever this is." Lynn nodded, grateful for his guidance. The pallbearers returned to their task, filling in James's grave, while mourners placed flowers on the growing mound of earth. Through it all, Thunder stood watchful and still, his attention never leaving Lynn and the metal box she held. When the last shovelful of dirt had been placed and Pastor Wilson had offered a final blessing, the crowd turned expectantly to Lynn. Rather than heading to the house for the usual post-funeral gathering, they remained on the hillside, drawn by curiosity and the sense that something important was unfolding. Lynn retrieved the locked box from her car and brought it back to where Thunder waited. The horse's ears pricked forward as she approached, his eyes following the box in her hands. Using the key from the letter, Lynn opened the second box with a soft click. Inside were several folded documents held together with a large paper clip, along with a smaller envelope with her name written on it. She opened the envelope first, finding another letter from her father. "Lynn," she read aloud, "by now you've found both boxes thanks to Thunder. What I'm about to tell you might come as a shock, but it's been my plan for years now." Lynn paused, glancing at the legal documents beneath the letter. The top sheet was headed Last Will and Testament, but the rest were unfamiliar to her. "I've decided to leave the ranch, all 400 acres of it, not to you as everyone expects, but to establish something new. A sanctuary for wild horses." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Bill Jenkins' face darkened and several other ranchers exchanged concerned glances. "Now before you think your old dad has completely lost his mind," Lynn continued, a smile tugging at her lips despite her tears. "Hear me out. The wild herds are disappearing, Lynn. Every year, more of their range is taken for development, or fenced off for cattle. In 10 years, there might not be any truly wild horses left in these hills." Lynn had never heard her father speak this way when he was alive. James had been a practical man, more concerned with fence posts and hay prices than conservation. Yet here in his final message, she glimpsed a passion she hadn't known he possessed. "The ranch has been in our family for 3 generations, but times change. You made your life in the city, and that's as it should be. You wouldn't be happy here, working this land. But the horses would be. Thunder would be." Thunder shifted his weight at the mention of his name, his dark eyes fixed on Lynn as she read. "The legal papers in this box establish the Sullivan Wild Horse Sanctuary as a nonprofit organization. I've worked with a lawyer in the city to set everything up properly. There's money from your mother's life insurance that I never touched, enough to maintain the property for several years until the sanctuary can apply for grants and donations." Lynn flipped through the documents, stunned by her father's thoroughness. There were articles of incorporation, tax forms, even preliminary plans for converting parts of the ranch to better serve as a sanctuary. "I'm asking you to serve as the sanctuary's first director," she read, her voice catching. "Not forever, just long enough to get it established. A year, maybe 2. I know it's a lot to ask, to put your city life on hold. But I believe this is important work, Lynn, more important than anything I've done in my life." Frank stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Lynn's shoulder as she continued reading. "Thunder will show you what the horses need. He understands both worlds, wild and tame. He can be the bridge just as he was for me." Lynn looked up at the horse, seeing him with new eyes. Was it possible her father was right? That this animal somehow understood what was happening, what was needed? "I kept this plan secret," because I knew there would be opposition. Bill Jenkins and some of the others have been trying to get rid of the wild herds for years. They see them as pests, competitors for grazing land. I didn't want them interfering before everything was legally established. As if on cue, Bill pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "James can't just turn productive ranch land into some horse playground. It'll attract more of those destructive animals." "Actually, he can," Doc Miller spoke up, adjusting his glasses. "It's his land, or was." He nodded respectfully toward the fresh grave. Other voices joined in, some supporting Bill's outrage, others defending James's right to do what he wanted with his property. The peaceful funeral had transformed into a community debate. Thunder suddenly reared up, his front hooves pawing at the air. The crowd fell silent, stepping back in alarm. When he returned to all fours, he moved to stand beside Lynn, as if physically aligning himself with her against the criticism. Lynn felt a strange calm settle over her as she looked from the horse to the gathered townspeople. She didn't know if she could do what her father asked, leave her job, her apartment, her life in Portland to run a wild horse sanctuary. It seemed impossible, impractical. Yet something about Thunder's unwavering presence, about the detailed plans her father had made, about the passion evident in his final letters, made her pause. Maybe James Sullivan hadn't been just a stubborn old rancher set in his ways. Maybe he'd seen something important that others had missed. "My father," Lynn said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "spent his entire life on this land. He understood it better than anyone. If he believed this sanctuary was the right thing to do, I have to at least consider it." She placed her hand on Thunder's neck, drawing strength from his solid warmth. "And after seeing how this horse knew exactly where to find that buried box, I'm starting to think Dad was right about a lot of things I didn't understand." Bill Jenkins snorted in disgust and turned away, followed by a few others. But most of the funeral guests remained, their faces thoughtful, curious, even supportive. James Sullivan, Pastor Wilson mused, always did like to have the last word. A ripple of laughter broke the tension, and Lynn found herself smiling through her tears. Her father had orchestrated this moment from beyond the grave, using a horse, of all things, to ensure his final wishes would be understood and honored. Thunder nickered softly and nudged her shoulder as if to say, "Well, what happens next?" Lynn didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since arriving back at the ranch, she felt a spark of something unexpected taking root. Not just grief for what she'd lost, but curiosity about what might lie ahead. 2 weeks after the funeral, Lynn sat at her father's kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers and an open laptop. The house felt different now. Not empty exactly, but changed. She'd spent the past 14 days sorting through James's belongings, reading the sanctuary documents over and over and trying to decide what to do next. Outside, Thunder grazed in the pasture closest to the house. He hadn't left the property, though Lynn had removed his halter the day after the funeral, giving him the freedom to return to the wild if he chose. Each morning, she expected to find him gone. Each morning, he was there waiting for her, standing patiently by the kitchen window. A knock at the door pulled Lynn from her thoughts. Frank stood on the porch holding a cardboard box. "Found these in my barn," he said, setting the box on the table. "James left them there last fall. Asked me to hang on to them until after he was gone." Lynn opened the box to find several worn, leather-bound journals. She picked one up, recognizing her father's handwriting on the first page. "His diaries," she murmured. "I didn't know he kept any." Frank nodded. "Started after your mother passed. Said writing helped him make sense of things." After Frank left, Lynn made a fresh pot of coffee and began reading. The earliest journal was dated shortly after Rose's death, filled with James's raw grief and struggle to continue alone on the ranch. The writing was simple but heartfelt, revealing a side of her father Lynn had rarely glimpsed when he was alive. As she moved through the journals chronologically, she watched her father slowly rebuild his life. There were entries about the changing seasons, about neighbors helping with the harvest, about Lynn's infrequent visits and phone calls. James wrote about his disappointment when she moved to Portland, but also his gradual understanding of her need to find her own path. Then, in the journal dated from last winter, everything changed. The first entry about Thunder filled 3 pages, describing in detail how James had found the injured horse and brought him to the barn. "There's something about this animal," James had written. "Something in his eyes that reminds me of myself, stubborn, independent, but maybe a little lonely too." Lynn read for hours as her father documented Thunder's recovery and their growing bond. James described how the horse seemed to sense when his pain was bad, standing closer on those days, offering silent companionship. He wrote about their walks together, about how Thunder would wait outside his bedroom window on mornings when James couldn't get out of bed. "Doc Miller says the cancer's spreading faster than they thought," one entry read. "Told me to get my affairs in order." Funny phrase that. My affairs have never been particularly orderly. The next pages detailed James's growing concern about the wild horse herds. He'd noticed fewer of them each year, pushed out by expanding ranches and housing developments. He'd attended county meetings where ranchers like Bill Jenkins advocated for removing the pests entirely. "People forget these horses were here first," James wrote. "They belong to this land in a way we never will." Lynn was surprised to read about her father's research into wildlife sanctuaries, his consultations with a lawyer in the city, his careful financial planning. James Sullivan, who'd always seemed to live entirely in the present, had spent his final months planning for a future he wouldn't see. The last journal entry was dated just a week before Lynn had arrived at the ranch. "Thunder knows I'm dying," James had written, his handwriting shakier than in earlier entries. "Don't know how, but he does. Stood outside my window all night. When I finally got up this morning, he followed me to Rose's grave. Watched me bury the metal box with the key and letter inside. Smart animal. Hope he remembers where it is when the time comes. Hope Lynn understands what I'm trying to do here. It's not just about the horses. It's about preserving something important before it's gone for good." Lynn closed the final journal, wiping tears from her cheeks. Outside, darkness had fallen. She went to the window and saw Thunder standing in the moonlight, his head raised as if keeping watch. "I think I understand now, Dad," she whispered. The next morning, Lynn called her boss in Portland. The conversation was difficult, but not as much as she'd expected. After explaining the situation, she was surprised when he offered her a 6-month leave of absence rather than accepting her resignation. "Take the time you need," he told her. "The position will be here if you decide to come back." With that piece settled, Lynn turned her attention to the sanctuary plans. James had done most of the groundwork, but there were still permits to file, infrastructure to build, and most importantly, community support to secure. Lynn decided to start there. She organized an open house at the ranch, inviting everyone in Pine Valley to come learn about the Sullivan Wild Horse Sanctuary. She spent days preparing presentations, printing James's journal entries about the declining herds and gathering data on successful sanctuaries in other states. The day of the open house arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Lynn had set up tables and chairs under the large oak tree where Thunder had stood during the funeral. The horse himself seemed to understand the importance of the day, staying visible but maintaining a respectful distance as people began to arrive. To Lynn's surprise, nearly the entire town showed up. Even Bill Jenkins came, though he stood apart from the others, arms crossed defensively over his chest. "Thank you all for coming," Lynn began once everyone had settled with plates of food and drinks. "As you know, my father's last wish was to establish a sanctuary for wild horses here on our family ranch," she explained James's vision, "a place where the remaining wild herds could find safety, where people could come to learn about these animals and their importance to the region's history and ecosystem." She shared statistics about declining wild horse populations and read selected passages from her father's journals. "This wasn't a sudden decision or the whim of a dying man," Lynn explained. "Dad spent months researching and planning. He believed this land could serve a greater purpose." Mrs. Abernathy raised her hand. "It's a lovely idea, dear, but how will you manage it? You have your life in the city." "I've taken a leave of absence from my job," Lynn replied. I'll be staying here to get the sanctuary established." This announcement caused a stir among the guests. Lynn had been known as the Sullivan who couldn't wait to leave Pine Valley behind. "And what about funding?" asked another neighbor. "Sanctuaries aren't cheap to run." Lynn outlined the financial plan James had created. The seed money from roses, life insurance, potential grants they could apply for, and the possibility of tourism bringing revenue to the entire community. "Pine Valley isn't exactly a tourist destination," someone pointed out. "Not yet," Lynn agreed. "But people are increasingly interested in ecotourism, in authentic experiences that connect them with nature. The sanctuary could put Pine Valley on the map." The conversation continued, with questions, concerns, and suggestions flowing freely. Lynn was surprised by how much thought her father had put into every aspect of the plan, and by how much she found herself believing in it as she spoke. Finally, Bill Jenkins stepped forward. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice gruff. "But those wild horses are destructive. They compete with our cattle for grazing land, damage fences, drain water resources. James might have had a soft spot for them, but the rest of us have livelihoods to protect." A tense silence fell over the gathering. Lynn had expected this objection but wasn't sure how to counter it. Before she could respond, Thunder approached, walking slowly but deliberately toward the group. People shifted, nervously, some backing away, but the horse ignored them all. He walked straight to Bill Jenkins and stopped directly in front of him, dark eyes meeting the rancher's surprised gaze. For a long moment, man and horse regarded each other in silence. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Thunder lowered his head, in what almost looked like a bow. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank murmured. Bill stared at the horse, his weathered face unreadable. Finally, he reached out a hesitant hand and lightly touched Thunder's neck. "James always said this horse was different," he said quietly. "Guess he was right about that at least." Thunder lifted his head and turned to look at Lynn as if to say, "Your move." "The sanctuary doesn't have to work against local ranchers," Lynn said, seizing the moment. "In fact, I'm hoping we can find ways to work together. Dad's vision wasn't about choosing horses over people. It was about finding a balance where both can thrive." By the end of the day, Lynn had formed a community advisory board for the sanctuary, with representatives from various segments of Pine Valley, including, to her surprise, Bill Jenkins, who grudgingly agreed to offer his perspective as a voice of reason. As the last guest departed, Lynn stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and purple. Thunder approached and stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," she told him, stroking his sleek neck. "Dad left us quite a project." In the months that followed, the Sullivan Wild Horse Sanctuary began to take shape. Old corrals were repaired, new fencing installed, a small visitor center constructed in what had once been James's barn. Lynn applied for grants, created a website, and began networking with wildlife experts and other sanctuary operators. The first new arrivals came that fall, 3 mares and a colt from a herd being pushed out by a housing development in the next county. Thunder watched their arrival with keen interest, keeping his distance at first, then gradually approaching, to establish himself as the herd's leader. Lynn's 6-month leave of absence came and went. When her boss called to ask when she'd be returning to Portland, she found herself saying, "I don't think I will be." The decision surprised her as much as it did him, but somehow it felt right. The sanctuary was growing, attracting visitors and volunteers from surrounding communities. Lynn had discovered a talent for grant writing and public speaking that she never knew she possessed, and she'd found an unexpected peace in continuing her father's legacy. One evening, a year after James's funeral, Lynn hiked to the hilltop where her parents were buried. She'd made it a weekly ritual, a chance to update her father on the sanctuary's progress and to remember the family she'd once taken for granted. As she crested the hill, she found Thunder already there, standing quietly between the 2 simple headstones. The horse acknowledged her with a soft nicker but remained where he was, as if standing guard. Lynn sat on the bench nearby, watching as the setting sun turned the valley golden. In the distance she could see the new herd grazing peacefully, now 15 strong and growing. On the main road, a small tour bus was departing after the day's final sanctuary visit. "I think he'd be proud," she said aloud. "Don't you?" Thunder turned to look at her, his intelligent eyes somehow conveying agreement. Then he did something he'd never done before. He approached the bench and lowered himself to the ground beside it, folding his legs beneath him as if settling in for a conversation. Lynn laughed, surprised and touched by the gesture. "You really did understand him, didn't you? And now you're stuck with me." Thunder huffed softly, resting his head against her knee. Lynn stroked his forehead, finding comfort in the connection that had once been her father's. Below them, Pine Valley spread, out in the fading light, the sanctuary at its heart. Not exactly the life Lynn had planned for herself, but one she was coming to treasure, a legacy of understanding between humans, animals, and the land they shared, begun by a man and a horse who had recognized something valuable in each other. "Thank you," she whispered, speaking to her father, to Thunder, to whatever twist of fate had brought them all together. "Thank you for showing me the way home."